I sat alone at my sister's Marine Corps parade while my family told the entire crowd I was a failure. They laughed and congratulated her, saying she was the real soldier of the family. Meanwhile, I stayed in the back, quietly watching. Then, her general turned, looked straight at me, and saluted. He called out, "Wait, you're the Special Operations Commander?" The entire crowd stopped. My mother covered her mouth. My sister's face went pale. In that single moment, the story my family told about me shattered forever. My name is Riley Hart. I grew up in Jacksonville, North Carolina, in a family where military service wasn't just a job, it was an identity. My father, Thomas, served in the Navy and still carries that authority in his voice like a permanent echo. My mother, Margaret, never wore a uniform but devoted her life to community events and building the perfect image of our family. My grandmother, Nana Louise, is gentle but firm, a woman who believes in traditions and loyalty to the family name. Then there's Julia, my younger sister. She's 5 years younger than me and has always been the bright star. She's loud, charismatic, fearless in a way that makes people gravitate toward her. When we were kids, she was the one entering talent shows and leading school pep rallies. I was the quiet one, always reading or training alone. When Julia decided to join the Marines, my parents treated it like she had won a national championship. They threw her a huge send-off party with banners, speeches, and neighborhood guests. I was the one taking photos, making sure her uniform looked perfect. When I left for my own training, there were no banners. No guests. No speeches. Just a quiet dinner where my father barely looked at me and my mother asked if I was sure I could handle it. I chose special operations because I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted to serve in a way that felt real to me, without the noise or the shallow praise. My work was dangerous, classified, and often meant I disappeared for months without a single call home. I didn't tell them much because they never really asked. They liked telling people I had left the program or that I was trying to find myself. Over time, they turned me into the family ghost. Julia, on the other hand, became their trophy. Every holiday, my parents would gather neighbors and brag about her rising rank, her awards, her leadership. They needed her story to prove to the world that they had done something right. My mother would say, "Julia really carried the torch. Riley, well, she's still figuring things out." My father would laugh, raising his glass like it was all harmless fun. But inside, those words sliced at me, each one confirming that I was invisible in my own family. Despite that, I always showed up for Julia. When she graduated boot camp, I sat in the back. When she pinned her sergeant rank, I clapped politely from the sidelines. I didn't want to ruin her moment. I thought that by stepping back, I was being a good sister. The day of Julia's big Marine Corps promotion parade, I arrived early. I stood alone, close enough to see but far enough that no one would notice me. As guests filed in, I heard my mother whispering to neighbors, "Riley tried the military but couldn't handle the discipline." My father laughed loudly nearby, telling a group of officers that Julia was the real warrior. My grandmother sat quietly, wringing her hands in her lap, glancing at me from time to time but never saying a word. I felt the familiar sting in my chest, that sharp reminder that I didn't belong in their story. I had trained harder, risked more, and carried heavier burdens than they would ever know. But to them, I was the failure they told stories about to make Julia look even brighter. I looked at Julia on the parade ground, standing tall in her uniform, saluting, receiving cheers from the crowd. I loved her, but I also saw how easily she let the lies slide. She didn't correct them. She didn't defend me. Maybe she didn't know the whole truth, or maybe she didn't want to. As I stood there, my heart pounding and my hands clenched. I had no idea that the entire narrative my family built for years was about to be torn apart in front of everyone they had tried so hard to impress. The morning of Julia's promotion parade was bright and humid, the kind of Carolina heat that sticks to your skin like a second layer. Families gathered early, waving small flags and buzzing with excitement. As I walked across the lot, I could already hear my father's booming voice before I even saw him. He stood near the front, surrounded by neighbors and old Navy buddies, laughing loudly and slapping shoulders. Margaret hovered nearby, greeting people with her perfected, polite smile, the one she practiced in the mirror before every social event. She fussed over Julia's uniform, smoothing down her sleeves and checking every pin twice. Julia stood proudly, soaking it all in, her face lit up by the attention and admiration. I took my place in the back row. I chose a spot near the far edge where I could see but stay mostly hidden. As guests filtered in, I heard pieces of conversation drift through the air like small cuts. "Is that Riley? I thought she didn't finish training. Oh, she came back home for a bit, right? Couldn't handle it." Margaret's voice carried over the noise. "She tried, bless her heart. Some people just aren't built for the real thing." She laughed lightly, as if I were an amusing footnote in a larger, more important story. My father added to the performance. "We always knew Julia had the spirit. She was born to lead. Riley, well, she always liked reading and drawing. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose, but she didn't have the fight in her. The words hit like rocks against my ribs. I stood there, each comment landing heavier than the last, feeling the sharp edge of betrayal from the people who were supposed to know me best. They didn't just misunderstand me. They had rewritten me completely, turned me into a fragile shadow. They could dismiss to make Julia shine brighter. Julia heard them too. I saw her glance back at me for a second, her eyes flickering with something that looked almost like guilt before she turned away quickly to hug another guest. It wasn't the first time she'd let it slide. She had always loved the narrative, where she was the hero and I was the sister who couldn't cut it. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, stood near me with her parents. She wore a small Marine Corps cap and looked up at me shyly. "Are you a Marine too?" she asked, her voice soft and full of hope. Before I could answer, her mother quickly pulled her back. "No, sweetie, that's Julia's sister. She didn't make it through training. Let's go up front and see the real Marines." I felt my stomach drop. The little girl looked back at me with confusion before being tugged away. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. I turned my eyes to Julia again. She looked radiant in her dress blues, chatting with a group of officers who clearly adored her. My father kept introducing her as the pride of the heart. Family, repeating it like a badge he wore on his own chest. Then came the speeches. The base commander stepped up to the microphone, welcoming families and praising Julia's achievements. Margaret stood next to Julia, beaming, holding her phone up to record every word. Thomas stood on the other side, nodding proudly, his arm around Julia's shoulder. When Julia took the mic, she started by thanking her commanding officers and mentors. Then she turned to the crowd, her voice steady and confident. "I want to thank my family," she said. "My parents, for showing me what service and discipline look like. And my sister, Riley, for teaching me to dream big, even if she couldn't find her own path in the military." A low ripple moved through the audience. Some people nodded in agreement, others exchanged curious looks. I felt my face flush with heat. My lungs tightened, every breath scraping against the walls of my chest. I wanted to walk away right then, disappear before they could take any more pieces of me. But my feet stayed rooted to the ground. Something deeper than anger held me there. A quiet, sharp resolve building in the space where my hurt used to live. My eyes found my grandmother sitting in the front row. Her hands twisted in her lap, her shoulders tense. She looked back at me with sad, searching eyes, like she finally understood the cost of their lies but didn't know how to stop it. That moment, I realized I had spent years protecting them from the truth, shielding them from discomfort, hiding my real story so they wouldn't have to face their own smallness. But now, watching Julia bask in applause built on my silence, I knew I couldn't keep hiding. The tension wasn't just in my family anymore. It had spread to the entire crowd, an invisible crack running through their applause, waiting for something to break it wide open. As I stood there, fists clenched, I felt my heartbeat shift from pain to power. I knew the moment was coming, and when it did, I wouldn't run. The crowd began to settle after Julia's speech, but I could feel the tension still hanging in the air, thick and electric. Julia stepped off the stage, smiling and shaking hands with guests, soaking up every congratulatory hug and praise. My father walked alongside her proudly, puffing out his chest as if her accomplishments were his own. Margaret dabbed at her eyes dramatically, turning to neighbors and whispering, "She's always been our warrior. We always knew she would make it." I watched from the edge of the grass, still gripping the program they had handed out at the entrance. My nails dug into the paper, leaving small half-moon imprints. My breath felt tight in my chest, like I was bracing for an impact I couldn't avoid. Then I noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Guests began murmuring and turning their heads toward the main aisle. At first, I thought maybe another speaker had arrived or a late family member was coming in. But then I saw him, General Monroe. The base commanding general, walked down the path with 2 aides trailing behind him. He was a towering figure, medals gleaming on his uniform, his steps calm and deliberate. As he moved, conversations dropped away one by one, creating a ripple of silence that spread across the field. My mother noticed him first. She quickly straightened her blouse and smoothed her hair, elbowing my father to pay attention. Julia, caught up in another round of photos, looked up and froze, her smile faltering for the first time all morning. General Monroe stopped at the edge of the small crowd surrounding Julia and scanned the faces carefully. His eyes skipped past Julia, past my parents, and landed on me standing alone by the back row. His face lit up with a mix of surprise and recognition. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm but carrying a warmth that turned every head instantly. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on me. "Are you Commander Riley Hart?" Time seemed to slow. My heart thudded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. My parents turned at once, mouths slightly open, as if they hadn't understood the words. Julia's eyes widened, and her hands dropped to her sides, her polished confidence draining away. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper, and nodded. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice steady even though my body felt like it might split open. From the rush of adrenaline, General Monroe took another step forward and snapped into a sharp, respectful salute. The motion was crisp and unmistakable, the kind of salute given only to those who had truly earned it. "It is an absolute honor to meet you in person," he said. "Your leadership in special operations has saved countless lives. Your teams still talk about your bravery and quiet strength. We are all in your debt." A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. The neighbors who had whispered about me being a dropout went silent, their eyes wide and searching. My father's face turned pale, his lips twitching as though trying to form words he didn't have. Margaret looked at me as if seeing a ghost, her hands trembling where they clutched her phone. Julia stepped forward, her voice small and shaky. "Riley, you're the commander he's talking about? Your special operations?" I met her eyes for the first time that day, holding her gaze without looking away. "Yes. While you were at home celebrating promotions, I was leading missions most people can't even imagine. I never needed you to understand it. I needed you to respect it." Julia looked like she had been slapped, her face slack with shock. She opened her mouth to respond but no sound came out. General Monroe turned back to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to address them all. "This is what true service looks like. Not just medals or parades but the sacrifice no one sees. Commander Hart represents everything we strive to be." The silence cracked, and people began to applaud hesitantly at first, then louder, until it rolled across the field like thunder. Guests turned toward me, their eyes filled with awe and confusion, trying to piece together the story they had been told versus the truth standing in front of them. My father finally stepped forward, his expression stricken. "Riley." I didn't know. I looked at him calmly. "You never wanted to know." For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking to make them comfortable. I wasn't hiding in the background. The weight of years of silence fell away from my shoulders in that single moment. General Monroe lowered his salute and shook my hand firmly, his respect clear and unwavering. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said again, his words echoing in my chest like a promise that I would never let myself disappear again. I straightened my spine, meeting the eyes of everyone who had ever doubted me. In that moment, I wasn't just a ghost in my family's story. I was the author of my own. The applause started like a hesitant ripple, then grew stronger and more certain, rising into a full, thundering wave that rolled across the parade grounds. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest, not from fear, but from a rush of freedom I had never let myself feel. For so many years, I had stood at the edge of every family event, my presence nothing more than a convenient shadow they used to highlight Julia's brilliance. But now, all eyes were on me, and I felt seen in a way that was raw and electric. General Monroe lowered his salute and turned back toward Julia and my parents. He looked at them the way a teacher might look at students who had completely missed the point of the lesson. His voice was calm but carried a sharp edge that cut through the hot, heavy air. "I think your family might not have understood the full scope of what Commander Hart has done for this country," he said. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in a few seconds. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes wide and lost. For the first time, he wasn't the loudest man in the crowd. He wasn't anyone's hero in that moment. My mother's lips trembled as she tried to hold on to her rehearsed smile, but it faltered and finally disappeared. She stood there frozen, her phone still in her hand, as if she couldn't decide whether to film or hide it completely. Julia stepped forward shakily. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Her eyes filled with tears, but not the proud, celebratory tears she had been used to. They were tears of realization, of guilt, and of a sudden understanding that the narrative she had been part of wasn't just flawed, it was alive. "Riley," she said, her voice cracking, "why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me say those things about you?" I didn't know. I took a step forward, close enough that she had to look up at me. I kept my voice low and steady. "I didn't tell you because I didn't need your approval. You never asked. You were too busy playing the hero in front of them to notice the truth right beside you." Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. She looked down, her shoulders shaking as the weight of every careless word she had thrown at me finally crashed down on her. The guests began to murmur, small groups exchanging shocked glances. Some of my father's old Navy friends stood with their arms crossed, expressions hard to read. Neighbors who had believed my mother's gossip now looked at me with wide-eyed respect, as though they were only now realizing they had misjudged everything. General Monroe stepped forward again, addressing the crowd directly. "I have seen leaders from all corners of this country, but what Commander Hart represents is the rarest kind of strength, quiet service, invisible sacrifice. The kind of leadership that doesn't need applause to be real." Asterisk at those words, the applause surged. Again. Some people even stood, clapping harder, their faces turning from polite smiles to genuine, odd expressions. My father took a halting step toward me. His voice sounded small, like he didn't recognize it himself. Riley. I'm sorry. I should have known. I should have seen you. I looked at him, finally meeting his eyes without flinching. You didn't want to see me. You wanted a story you could control. But I don't belong to your story anymore. He lowered his head, and in that small, trembling motion, I saw the first real crack in the fortress he had built around his pride. My mother started to sob, her hand covering her mouth as she looked between me and Julia, as if she were watching her entire identity fall apart piece by piece. Julia fell to her knees in front of me, her hands gripping the edge of my uniform. I'm so sorry, Riley. I thought I was protecting the family image. I didn't know what it cost you. I bent down slightly, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't get to apologize and make this disappear. But you can choose to see me now, if you're ready. She nodded through her tears, her entire body shaking. I helped her stand, and for the first time, I saw a hint of genuine humility in her eyes. General Monroe nodded at me one last time, then turned to address the officers and families around us. Remember this moment. True service is not always what you see on a stage. Sometimes, it's the person you overlook, the one standing quietly at the edge. That's where you find the real warriors. As he stepped back, the final wave of applause rolled through the field. I looked around, feeling a warmth build in my chest. The story they had forced on me for years had finally crumbled, and in its place stood my truth, shining and unmovable. For the first time, I stood in the center, not because I needed their approval, but because I had earned every single piece of respect now laid before me. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't the failed sister in the back row. I was the leader they never thought to look for, the commander they couldn't deny, and in that moment, I knew I would never let them rewrite my story again. The parade ground slowly emptied as families began to leave, still whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some guests shot me lingering looks of awe, others looked embarrassed, as though they had personally contributed to the lie that had lived in my family for so long. The applause had ended, but the echo of that moment hung heavy in the air, like a new truth no one could ignore. Julia stayed close to me, her eyes red and puffy. She followed me without speaking, as if afraid I might disappear if she looked away. Even for a second. My father stood off to the side, his hands hanging limp at his sides. For the first time, he looked small, stripped of his loud voice and commanding presence. My mother leaned against the back of a chair, her head down, her face pale and tear-streaked. After the last guests left, I walked toward the edge of the field where a few trees offered a bit of shade. Julia trailed behind me like a shadow. She finally spoke, her voice low and rough. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was protecting our family's reputation. I thought, if I shined bright enough, maybe you wouldn't feel like you had to compete. I turned to her, feeling the weight of years pressing against my ribs. I never wanted to compete. I only wanted to serve. I didn't need a stage, I needed respect. You didn't have to protect me, you only had to stand beside me. She looked down, tears splashing onto her boots. I see that now, she said softly. I want to fix this. I want to be your sister for real, not just the version they wanted me to be. I placed a hand on her shoulder. For the first time, I saw Julia as human, stripped of the armor of perfection our parents had wrapped around her. She was just a woman trying to navigate expectations she hadn't fully understood. I squeezed her shoulder gently. That's up to you. You'll have to earn it. My father approached slowly, each step looking heavier than the last. His voice was shaky, unfamiliar. Riley, I was wrong. I thought I knew what strength looked like. I thought I was raising warriors, but I see now I was chasing an image, not the truth. I met his eyes steadily, refusing to give him the comfort of forgiveness too easily. You didn't see me because you didn't want to. You turned me into a failure in your mind so you wouldn't have to question your own ideas of success. I carried my missions alone, but I shouldn't have had to carry your pride, too. His shoulders fell. He nodded, unable to argue. For once, he was silent, and in that silence, I felt a tiny shift, the first crack in the towering wall he had built around his beliefs. My mother stepped forward next, her hands trembling. I repeated the stories because it was easier than facing the truth. I was so focused on what other people thought of us that I lost sight of who you really were. I'm so sorry, Riley. I looked at her, feeling old wounds pulse in my chest. I don't need you to apologize to protect your image now. I need you to learn how to speak the truth, even when it's ugly and uncomfortable. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she looked fragile, and maybe for the first time, truly honest. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Neighbors who once whispered about my failure now stopped me in town to say they had no idea. Some looked ashamed, others awkwardly offered thanks. But I didn't live for their approval anymore. Their praise felt as light and empty as their old judgments. Julia started visiting me regularly, sometimes bringing letters she had written but couldn't say out loud. Each one was an attempt to understand, to rebuild the connection she had let slip away. I read each one slowly, answering only when I was ready. Trust was a bridge she would have to walk one careful step at a time. My father began coming to my talks when I visited local veteran centers. He sat in the back, listening quietly, no longer trying to interrupt or steer the narrative. I never knew if he fully understood, but for the first time, he was trying, and that was enough for now. My mother started correcting people when they tried to bring up the old stories. No, she would say firmly, Riley didn't fail. She chose a harder path. And she led in ways none of us will ever fully understand. Hearing that made me feel like, maybe, she was starting to understand the cost of her silence. Standing in my truth taught me that strength isn't about medals or parades. It's about the quiet conviction to keep going when no one is cheering, about leading when no one sees. People will try to write your story for you, to fit their comfort zones and their small definitions of success. But the moment you stand up, claim your voice, and refuse to shrink, you take back the pen. You become the author of your own life. In that moment on the parade field, I didn't just reclaim my story. I showed them, and myself, that I was never the failure they imagined. I was the quiet storm they never saw coming. And from that day forward, I knew I would never fade into the background again.